Hey guys, it is video 2 for lesson 1 for unit 1. How true is history? Black scholars on history. I'm going to give you some background information in this video, and it is working towards our lesson objective of students will be able to challenge previous notions of American history. So I want to teach you a little more about W.E.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin, and then kind of remind you about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. These 4 Black scholars will be referenced in the article that I want you to read. And so I just want to make sure that you kind of know who they are and what they were all about. W.E.B. Du Bois, take some notes on him in your packet, please. He lived from 1868 to 1963. He was a scholar and an activist. He was the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard University in 1895, which was a huge feat, not just because he was the first, but because he was not, his 4 years of undergraduate work were not credited because it was not at a white university. So he had to redo those 4 years before he could go to Harvard to get his PhD. Crazy. He fought for 7 decades for racial justice. So he lived to be almost 100 and spent so much time fighting and writing and speaking. He co-founded the NAACP in 1909. And he also, according to Eddie S. Glaude Jr., dedicated his life to exposing America's lies. He did it mostly through writing books. He wrote different types of nonfiction books. His magnus opus, his most important, biggest book, was Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935. And this book was really the first book, to challenge the prevailing racist historical narrative of Reconstruction and instead retells the history from the perspective of African Americans. So Reconstruction is the time period after the Civil War, when slaves were emancipated, given the right to vote, and many actually went on to become congressmen and, held these positions of power in the highest echelons of government when they were actually born slaves. So it was this incredible change suddenly, but it didn't last. And that is the part that W.E.B. Du Bois talks about. The slave went free, he says, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery. And his point in his book is that it's because there were a system of laws that forced this to happen. This white supremacy instituting the laws that would then become Jim Crow and all of the legal oppressive acts that were taken. And so he talks about the propaganda of history, the fact that those in power retell history inaccurately in order to further their power. And so people were the historical narrative that was most common in that time was not that these laws were put into place that to stop people, Black people, from having certain freedoms, from voting, from all of these things. And that was the propaganda of history that W.E.B. Du Bois was challenging. There's a great 2-minute video on Black Reconstruction so that you can understand this a little bit better that Henry Louis Gates does, and I'd love for you to watch that. Martin Luther King Jr., 1929 to 1968, minister and leader of the modern civil rights movement. He believed in nonviolent activism to achieve legal equality for African Americans in the United States rather than any means necessary. Nonviolent resistance included protests, grassroots organizing, and civil disobedience. And so you'll see how he'll be put somewhat opposite of James Baldwin in the article that you're going to read. So watch for that. Malcolm X will also be mentioned in the article. He lived from 1925 to 1965. He was a leader in the civil rights movement, minister and supporter of Black nationalism. He urged Black Americans to protect themselves against white aggression by any means necessary. So this is where he differed from Martin Luther King Jr. And he was part of the Nation of Islam, a belief system that merged Islam with Black nationalism. He was assassinated in 1965. After which Alex Haley, who had recorded thousands of hours of interviews with Malcolm X, published a collection basically that he turned into this book, the autobiography of Malcolm X, written from the point of view of Malcolm X, based on all of these interviews. And what's really interesting in the book is that towards the end of his life, he did start to reject those separatist views of having a separate nation for Blacks. And so it would have been really interesting to know what would have come next for Malcolm X. But of course, we are not that fortunate to know. He also inspired the Black Power movement of the 60s and the 70s. James Baldwin, he lived from 1934 to 1987. He was a writer and activist, grew up in Harlem, practiced to be a minister. By the time he was age 14, he was working as a minister. But then he ends up rejecting the church. And then he kind of rejects America. He leaves for Paris at 24. And he wrote his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, published in 1953, about 5 years later. And then for about 10 years, he travels from Paris to New York to Istanbul, writing 2 books of essays, Notes of a Native Son, Nobody Knows My Name, and then these novels, Giovanni's Room and Another Country. He continues to write more essays, including The Fire Next Time, and more novels. I'm sorry, I don't have them all listed here. The essays explored racial tension with eloquence and unprecedented honesty. The novels dealt with taboo themes like homosexuality and interracial relationships. And so the article that I want you to read is really about James Baldwin's point of view and how he sees history working at a certain point in the civil rights movement. So read the article. It's not an easy read. I want you to do something very specific as you're reading it, which is to find these ideas about history. Baldwin has an idea that history is trapped in us. People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. Look at some of the other things that he thinks about history as you're reading the article. And if you want to know a little more about James Baldwin, this is a great short 4-minute video about his life. Good luck as you work on this activity. Feel free to work on it with somebody else so that you can kind of force yourself to get through it. It's not an easy read. Okay, good luck.